Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. They thought he was dead, and they were responsible for his death the way they saw it. In fact, earlier in the passage, as you read of this story, you realize that these guys have repented of it. They realized what they had done and that it was wrong. And now suddenly they find out that Joseph is alive, and this is the first connection they have with him since they sold him into slavery, or that they know about that they've had with him. Then Joseph says to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you for a remnant, to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." I want us to take a look at discovering God's plans. And there are some principles that we see in this passage of Scripture that tell us some insight for understanding what it is that God does and how God does it. You realize, you have to remember that Joseph's life had been a life of chaos. One problem after another problem, accused of this, sold into slavery again, he's accused of rape, he's thrown into prison, he's forgotten in prison. It was just one miserable mistake after another. You ever have a life that seemed like it just, every day you wake up and you want to go, "What's going to happen today?" Are some of you like that right now? You know, you don't have to say, "Yes, it's me," but some of us are like that. You know, it's just because everything seems to go wrong in life. One thing after another seems to just overwhelm us. The problems are just insurmountable. And so, through all of that, through everything that happened with Joseph's life, all of those things that went wrong, finally things started going right. And then we begin to see how God's plan began to work out. But not before all of the crisis, all of the difficult times, all of those things that had gone wrong. So let's take a look at how we can discover God's plan for our lives and how we see what God is up to. The first thing that we notice is that God's plans seldom make sense. They just don't make sense sometimes. In Psalms chapter 80, the 80th Psalm, verses 8 through 12, I want you to see this little passage. "You transplanted a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it, and it took root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. Its branches reached as far as the sea. It shoots as far as the river." And then notice this. "Why have you broken down its walls, so that all who pass by pick its grapes? Boars from the forest ravage it, and insects from the fields feed on it." This passage in Psalm is basically saying, God, you did all of these great things. All of these things seem to really be coming together, and then all of a sudden, it all fell apart. Why, God? Why did that happen? Why did you let something like this happen? It's so important to remember in our lives, when things seem to go wrong time after time after time after time, it's important to understand one very important thing. God thinks bigger than you do. It's so easy for us to get so focused on what's happening in our life, and it's a big issue. The difficulties in our lives are big, big issues to us. But you see, God sees beyond the frame of the picture. If we put a frame around the issues of our life, that frame would be a painting of the difficulties. But God looks at the bigger picture. He sees beyond what we framed in for our life and said, this is a picture of my life. And God says, no, 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 no. The frame is a lot bigger. I'm looking at your picture from a whole different, your life from a whole different perspective. What you consider to be the explanation, the expression of your life is just a very small part of what I see. God thinks bigger than you do, and His plans seldom make sense. If there was anybody who understood that principle, it was Job. Job had one disaster after another. He lost his children. He lost all of his cattle and his donkeys and his sheep. And he lost his farm and he lost his friends. The only thing he didn't lose was a cantankerous, mean old woman wife. At some point, Job was going, God, did you kind of miss something here? You know, she was a canker sore. You know, I mean, and so she was just a difficult person, and Job just could not get a break. And he never did figure it out on earth. He finally figured it out in heaven, I'm sure. But it was one of those things that God's plans just simply didn't make sense. God's plans very seldom make sense to us. Secondly, God's plans often include conflict. God's plans often include conflict. And Jesus warned about that. He told His disciples, listen, there are going to be difficulties in your life. In fact, John 15, one of the very last things that Jesus said to His disciples was this: if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Listen, the world hates you. The world hates what you represent. The world wants what you have, but they still hate you. They look at your life and they say, yeah, you got something, but, you know, you're not like us, so we're going to push you out of the way. We don't want to have anything to do with you. You scare us. You know, Jesus scared people. There are a number of passages in the Bible where Jesus came in, performed miracles, changed people's lives. I mean, the blind could see and the crippled could walk. And Jesus could do these incredible miracles, and it scared the people, and they asked Him to leave because they were afraid of Him. I mean, we look at that and we think, what was wrong with these people? But really, the truth of the matter is that's the way the world is. When the world sees these things, it scares them. They want it, but it scares them. And God's plans will include conflict in your life. Sometimes the conflict is what puts God's plan in motion. You know, sometimes your life is just going along and everything's smooth sailing, and then all of a sudden, boom, it all falls apart and you can't figure out why. And that's the very thing that begins to put God's plan in motion. Sometimes the conflict seems to thwart what we believe God is up to. I can't tell you how many times in my life I thought God wanted me to do something, and I was directing down a certain path, and all of a sudden I ran into a brick wall and it just seemed to fall apart, and I couldn't figure out. I'd be like, God, why? Why did you? What? This doesn't make sense. Why did you let me get this far if this is what was going to happen? It just didn't make sense at the time. But conflict sometimes causes us to think that God's plans are all wrong, all awry. And that conflict thwarts what we believe that God is up to. Sometimes the conflict is really a plan for a higher purpose. The things that God wants to do are bigger than the conflict itself. But we're focused on the conflict. I think often and over and over and over about those times when God uses the conflict to accomplish a greater thing. You know, my dad, I've told stories about my dad over and over and over again, and there's so many of those. I just spent a few days with him last weekend. And it was so good just to sit down and relive some of those stories. And you know, the interesting thing is that my dad always seems to find new, interesting truths when he tells me about some of those events that happened. He finds little nuggets, you know, and it's just amazing how God uses that to encourage and to grow me, you know, and I'm so grateful for that. But I realized that a lot of those times that were conflict, like the time he got thrown into jail for stealing a mule. Who'd have thought that a missionary would be thrown into jail for stealing a mule? Well, he didn't steal the mule, but they thought the mule was stolen, so they threw him in jail until they could figure it out. And he was in this little village up in the mountains in the jungle of Honduras, and they said, "You're going to stay here." I think I've told this story before, and I'm sorry for repeating it, but Dad was in this jail, and he said, "Well, since I'm here and I'm not going anywhere," he told the jailer, and it was just a little standalone jail, really not much more than a thatched hut. But he told the jailer, he says, "Well, since I'm here, I'm going to preach tonight." And he said, "Go tell everybody to gather around at dark and I'll preach." And so the jailer left. The jailer walks on. Dad's going to walk out of there. He was with another missionary. They thought, should we make a run for it? No, guess not. So the jailer goes and tells everybody, "Hey, the gringo's going to be preaching tonight. Everybody gather around." So right as it started getting dark, Dad and Martin Haylock was the other missionary. They started singing. And they sang as loud as they could, kind of like the way you guys sound when you sing Happy Birthday. And people started coming from the mountainsides everywhere. So, there was this big crowd that gathered around the dark. And one of them said, "We just came to hear what the noise was." And then Dad started preaching, and 9 young men got saved that night. And today, there's a fine little church in this little town of San Jose de la Venta. So, the conflict, what seemed to be this horrible thing that went wrong because they were on their way to another town to start another mission, and they were stopped in that path. That journey, that was so conflicted, was actually what God was up to all along. Sometimes the conflict is the plan for a higher purpose. Sometimes the conflict is never completely resolved on earth. It'll be resolved eventually. But sometimes the conflict in our lives will never be completely resolved. But we need to understand that God's plans often include conflict. The conflict isn't the issue. The conflict is the plan. The conflict isn't the issue is the plan. Don't focus so much on the conflict without understanding that the conflict is part of what God is up to. Because God's plans often include conflict. Number 3, God's plans are about the future. God's plans are about the future. Listen to this. This is one of the most important principles that you will ever discover in your life about the way God works. God's plans are not about your past. God isn't making plans in your life because He wants to get back at you for your past. God's not out to punish you for your past. Some of you need to be punished for your past. But God's not out to punish you for your past. God's making plans for your future. And His plans are not about your past. Jeremiah 29:11 says this, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you." By the word prosper there is shalom. It means peace, and it's the idea of prosperity in peace. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Do you see anything in there about your past? You see, God says, "Look, I am the God of the future. I'm looking at what I can do, not what's been done." God's plans are not about your past. God may use or He may not use your past to accomplish His purpose. But your past will not change God's plans for what He wants to accomplish through you. So important for you to understand. Your past will not change God's plans for what He wants to accomplish through your life. You could be the biggest mess up in the world. And I think some of you are running for that title, aren't you? You could be the biggest mess up in the world, but you know that God knew millions of years ago. He knew you. He knew what your life was going to be like. And He knew that He could develop and create a plan that would bypass your past. And He could use you beyond the past for the future. God is planning your future, including your eternal future.